The Silent Strategy. Why Saying Less Amplifies Your Power Complete Audiobook. You've been taught that power comes from speaking, from persuading, from explaining yourself into respect. You're wrong. The most influential people you know don't talk much. And when they do, every word lands differently than yours, not because they're smarter, but because they've learned an invisible rule. Every unnecessary word you speak diminishes your authority by 10%. Every silence you maintain increases it by 10%. This isn't about being quiet. This is about strategic speech. This is about understanding that in a world drowning in noise, silence has become the rarest, most powerful currency. Over the next 90 minutes, you're going to learn exactly how to use it. Chapter 1. Stop explaining, start leading. The psychological cost of justifying your existence. You are going to hear something in this chapter that contradicts everything you've been taught. And you're going to feel uncomfortable. That discomfort is where the transformation begins. Most people spend their entire lives asking for permission they don't need. Not explicitly, not out loud, but with every explanation, with every justification, with every time they defend a choice before anyone even questions it. That's the problem. And here's what you need to understand. Your explanation is an apology in disguise. You say you're explaining. You believe you're being reasonable, transparent, helpful. You think providing context proves your intelligence. But here's the truth. Every time you justify yourself, you signal one thing and one thing only. You believe you owe people access to your reasoning. You believe your decisions are negotiable. And the moment you believe that, everyone else does too. Let's be direct. You've been conditioned since childhood to justify your existence. Your parents asked why you did something. Teachers demanded explanations. Peers questioned your choices. And so you learned. To survive socially, you explain. That's not wisdom. That's a trap. The conditioning runs deep. When someone disagrees with you, your instinct fires immediately. Defend, explain, prove, convince. Your nervous system treats disagreement as a threat. So you talk. You elaborate. You provide evidence. You're essentially saying, please, let me prove I'm worth listening to. Please approve of me. Here's what separates leaders from everyone else. Leaders don't explain their decisions. They announce them. That's the key difference. Not the quality of the decision, not the intelligence behind it. The permission structure. When you explain preemptively, when you walk into a room and start justifying before criticism arrives, you've already lost. You've positioned yourself as the defendant. You're asking the jury to decide. The other person becomes the judge. And the moment you've made someone a judge of your choices, they will judge them. You have a choice. Right now, as you listen to these words, you can keep treating your decisions as negotiable, or you can stop. The instant you stop, the instant you shift from explaining to announcing, the entire dynamic changes. Suddenly, you're not the one being evaluated. Suddenly, the other person doesn't have permission to treat your choice as up for debate. That's not arrogance. That's sovereignty. And sovereignty is what leadership actually is. Picture this. A manager sits in a meeting. She has a project she's launching. She knows her team might have objections. Before anyone speaks, she starts explaining. She explains the market research. She explains the timeline. She explains why they've chosen this direction over alternatives. Her team watches this. And what do they perceive? Weakness, uncertainty, a leader who needs their approval before moving forward. Now picture a different leader. Same project, same potential objections. But this leader says, this is the direction we're taking. No elaboration, no preemptive defense. Just a statement. The team hears this differently. They perceive confidence, clarity. A leader who has made a decision and is now executing it. What changed? Not the project, not the quality of the thinking behind it. The permission structure. When you explain, you're asking for approval. When you state matter-of-factly, you're granting respect. You're saying, I've thought about this. I've made a decision, and I'm moving forward. There's no room for debate because you haven't positioned the conversation as a negotiation. This happens everywhere. In marriages, when you justify why you want to spend time with your friends instead of asking permission disguised as explanation. In business, when you announce a policy instead of defending it preemptively. In relationships, when you share your boundaries as statements, not requests. The second manager isn't being arrogant. She's being clear, and clarity is what creates respect. The first manager is drowning in explanations because she never learned this. When you stop treating your choices as negotiable, others stop treating them as negotiable. This isn't theory. This is how human psychology works. We mirror what we're shown. If you show someone that your decisions are open for debate, they'll debate them. If you show someone that your decisions are non-negotiable, they'll accept them. You don't need their permission to move forward. You already have permission. You're just not using it. Here's what's happening right now in your brain. Every time you feel the urge to explain, there's a neural pathway firing. It's the pathway between fear and speech, fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being wrong, and the automatic response is to talk, to explain, to try to control the narrative. That pathway is real. It's strong. It was built through years of conditioning, but pathways can be rewired. Neuroscience confirms this. With practice, you can create new patterns, different responses, different choices. Here's the practice. Every time you feel the urge to explain, pause and ask yourself one question. Am I defending or leading? That's it. One question. But it interrupts the automatic response. It brings consciousness to the moment. And consciousness is where choice lives. The answer to that question will almost always be, I'm defending. And in that moment, you'll know what you need to do. Stop. Be silent. Let the discomfort exist. Because here's what nobody tells you. Your silence isn't coldness. Your silence isn't rudeness. Your silence is sovereignty. When someone questions you and you sit with that discomfort without immediately responding, something shifts. You're not scrambling to defend. You're not performing. You're just there, present, unmoved. That presence is what changes everything. And I want to be specific about this because this is critical. I don't mean cold silence. I don't mean you withdraw or become hostile. I mean the silence of someone who is so certain in their decision that criticism simply doesn't register as a threat. You stay calm. You might even acknowledge what they said. I hear you. And then you move forward anyway. The repetition that rewires this. I don't owe you access to my reasoning. Say it, write it, internalize it. Every time you feel the urge to over-explain, this becomes your anchor. I don't owe you access to my reasoning. That doesn't mean you're closed-minded. That doesn't mean you don't consider feedback. It means your decisions don't require approval. Your choices aren't committees. Your life isn't a democracy where everyone gets a vote. It's your life. You're the sole decision-maker. The moment you truly believe that, not intellectually but in your nervous system, everything changes. You stop explaining. You stop justifying. You stop asking for permission you already have. And everyone around you notices. They respond differently. They treat you differently. Because you're showing them something they rarely see. A person who is completely, entirely comfortable with themselves. That's the power here. Your explanation is an apology in disguise. Stop apologizing for your decisions. You've just learned the first and most foundational shift in leadership. You stopped being the defendant in your own life. You claimed the authority that was always yours. You learned that explanation is a permission request, and you don't need permission anymore. This is sovereignty. This is where real leadership begins, with the quiet confidence that your choices don't require a jury. But here's what's coming next. Because once you stop explaining, once you stop seeking approval, once you claim your power, you have to protect it. And there's a force that will try to take it from you. a force that's been trained to pull you back into old patterns. We're going to talk about that force. We're going to expose it, and you're going to learn how to stand. Chapter 2. The silent cost of seeking validation. Why your words are actually a cry for approval. Listen to yourself. Not right now, later. Record yourself in a meeting. In a conversation with someone you respect. Listen to how you speak. Really listen, because I'm going to tell you something that will make you uncomfortable, and then you're going to hear the proof in your own voice. Every question mark at the end of your sentence is a cry for help. It's not punctuation. It's a validation request broadcast to everyone within earshot. You don't realize you're doing it, but you are. Constantly. You transform statements into questions. I think we should do this, don't you? Instead of, this is what we're doing. That upward inflection at the end isn't politeness. It's not collaboration. It's doubt. You've just told everyone in that room that your own words don't matter until someone else has verified them. You've made your statement dependent on their approval, and the moment you do that, you've lost. People who don't seek approval don't speak like this. They don't turn declarations into interrogations. They don't soften their words with unnecessary qualifiers. Listen to the difference. The person seeking approval says, I think we might want to consider maybe doing this if that's okay. The person who doesn't seek approval says, we're doing this. One person is performing. One person is leading. That's the entire difference. The psychological mechanism here is simple, and it's devastating. You're teaching people that your words don't matter until they've been verified by someone else. You're literally encoding into their brain the message, don't listen to this person until you've checked whether it's safe to. And once they've been conditioned to think that way about you, that's how they'll treat everything you say. You've poisoned your own authority by the way you deliver your words. This isn't about arrogance. This isn't about refusing to listen to other perspectives. This is about understanding that the way you speak teaches people how to treat you. Soft speech creates soft treatment. Tentative language creates tentative responses. Question marks create the need for validation. That's the architecture of it. Now here's where it gets worse. Once you begin seeking approval through speech, you become dependent on it. You're hooked. One person affirms you and suddenly you feel solid. One person questions you and suddenly you're destabilized. You're searching their face for signs of doubt. You're wondering if maybe you were wrong. You're already formulating ways to rephrase, to soften, to make it more palatable. This is the validation cycle. And it destroys authority in real time. It destroys it because authority comes from internal certainty, not external approval. The person who doesn't speak often and speaks only when certain doesn't have this vulnerability. They've built something you haven't. An internal validation system. Their words aren't performing for an audience. Their words are declarations of fact. They don't need you to agree to know they're right. They already know. Think about this distinction because it matters. The CEO who's constantly in emails, constantly explaining, constantly seeking buy-in, that CEO is frantically seeking approval. Every email is a validation request. Every message thread is a cry for confirmation. The people who work for that CEO sense this desperation. And respect doesn't come from desperation. It comes from certainty. Now think about the CEO who rarely speaks, who shows up to quarterly meetings and delivers a 10-minute update with absolute clarity and zero elaboration. Who doesn't ask for approval? Who doesn't soften the message? Who simply states what is and what will be? People seek that CEO out. People want to know what they think. Not because the CEO is demanding attention, but because the CEO's certainty is magnetic. That's the power difference. The second CEO isn't more intelligent, isn't necessarily making better decisions. The only difference is in how they speak, in the certainty they broadcast, in the complete absence of the validation request. And because of that one difference, they're treated differently. They're followed differently. They're respected differently. Here's what you need to understand. The way you speak is training people. Right now. Every single day. You're training them to question you or to trust you, to seek your opinion or to ignore it, to treat you as an authority or as someone perpetually asking for permission. You're doing this training whether you realize it or not. And most of you are training people to doubt you, because you're constantly expressing doubt first. The question is, do you want to keep doing that? Or do you want to interrupt the pattern? This is where the practice comes in. And this is critical, because understanding this intellectually isn't enough. You need to wire this into your nervous system through repetition and action. Here's what you do. You state what you believe, or you state what you're doing. Then, and this part is the hardest part, you defend it 0 times. Not once, not with caveats, not with softening language. 0 times. If someone questions you, you respond with silence or a single sentence restatement. Never elaborate. Never soften. Never add the qualifiers that make you feel safe. I think, maybe, I could be wrong. Those words are poison. They're you, admitting in advance that you're not certain. So you sound uncertain, and people respond accordingly. Let's be concrete. Someone challenges your decision in a meeting. The old version of you launches into explanation. You add context. You provide the thinking behind it. You're trying to convince them. You're begging them to understand. You're seeking their approval. Don't do that anymore. The new version is simple. You hear the challenge. You pause. You say, "This is the decision." And then you move forward. That's it. No elaboration. No defense. No seeking their permission to be right. Are they going to be uncomfortable? Yes. Are they going to try to push back? Probably. What do? You stay silent. You don't elaborate. You don't soften. You simply exist in that discomfort with them until they accept it. Because acceptance isn't something you negotiate. It's something you require. This seems harsh when you're reading it. It seems cold. But that's because you've been conditioned to believe that approval seeking is kindness. That's a lie. Seeking approval teaches people that your words are negotiable. It teaches them that they have a vote in your life. It makes them less respectful of you, not more. The cold clarity of stating your position without seeking approval is actually the kindest thing you can do because you're being honest about your authority. You're not pretending they have a choice when they don't. You're not performing certainty you don't feel. You're simply saying, "This is what is," and when you start doing this, watch what happens. People stop questioning you as much. Not because you're being harsh, but because you've removed the invitation to question. You haven't positioned it as a debate. You've positioned it as a fact. Facts don't need validation. They just are. Here's the repetition that rewires this. My words don't need your permission to be true. Say it. Write it down. Put it somewhere you'll see it. Every time you feel the urge to soften, to add a qualifier, to turn your statement into a question, my words don't need your permission to be true. That's your anchor. That's what pulls you back from seeking approval you've already given yourself. You came into this chapter with a habit, a deeply ingrained neural pathway that turns statements into questions. That softens your authority before anyone can challenge it. That seeks approval from people who should be seeking yours. You're leaving this chapter with a different understanding. You're understanding that the way you speak is a choice, and that choice has consequences. The consequences either build your authority or demolish it. You've learned that every question mark is a validation request. You've learned that seeking approval creates dependency and destroys certainty. And you've learned the practice that breaks the cycle. Speak once, defend nothing, move forward. This is what it means to stop broadcasting doubt. This is what it means to speak like someone who knows they're right. But here's the thing. Understanding is only half the battle. Because there's a voice that's going to resist this. There's a part of you that's been trained to seek approval since childhood. That part is going to fight you. It's going to whisper that you're being selfish or mean or arrogant. It's going to pull you back toward softness, toward qualification, toward the seeking of validation. And you need to know how to stand against that voice without breaking. You need to build an internal fortress so strong that the external pressure doesn't reach you, because the real authority doesn't come from what you say. It comes from what you refuse to defend. Chapter 3. Silence as a boundary weapon. How strategic non-response protects your peace. You've learned to stop explaining. You've learned to speak with certainty. Now you're going to learn something harder. How to not speak at all. Because silence isn't just the absence of speech. Silence is a weapon. It's a boundary. It's protection. And most people never learn to use it because they're terrified of it. Your instinct is to fill it. Someone asks you something personal, and the silence that follows feels like a vacuum. Your nervous system panics. It wants to fill that void. So you talk. You explain. You answer. You elaborate. You fill the space because emptiness makes you uncomfortable. But this is exactly where you're losing control. Silence is a boundary. It's a wall that says, this territory is not open for exploration. This part of my life is not available for your consumption. When you answer every question, you're signaling that everything about you is available. Your finances, your relationships, your insecurities, your doubts, your plans. All of it is open. People sense this, and they exploit it, often without realizing they're doing it. Strategic silence means some things die unanswered. Some questions expire without response. Some people never get the information they're fishing for. And this is where real power lives. Not in what you say, in what you refuse to say. Think about the people you respect most. The ones you actually listen to, the ones whose opinions matter. They don't answer every question. They don't fill every silence. They're selective, intentional. There's space around them. There's mystery. And that mystery creates respect. It creates distance that makes you want to close it. It creates intrigue. Now think about the people you don't respect. The ones who talk constantly. Who answer everything. Who overshare. Who make themselves completely available. You don't respect them because they've given you access to everything. There's no boundary. There's no protected space. There's nowhere you have to earn entry to. And without that boundary, there's no respect. This is the architecture of it. Respect is built on controlled access, on the protection of your inner world, on the strategic use of silence to say, not all of you gets to go everywhere. Some of me stays private. And if you want access to that, you're going to have to earn it. Most people never establish this boundary. So they're never truly respected. They're just consumed. Here's what happens when you start using silence as a boundary. People will push back, hard. They'll ask again. They'll push harder. They'll become uncomfortable. This discomfort means your boundary is working. This is critical to understand because your instinct will be to soften when they push. Don't. When they become uncomfortable, that's the moment you hold firm. That's the moment the boundary actually gets built. People who are used to extracting information from you will become frustrated first. Then angry. They'll try different angles. They'll try to shame you. They'll say you're being secretive or cold or selfish. Let them. Your silence is a muscle being built. Every time they push and you don't fill the void, that muscle gets stronger. Every time you stay silent instead of explaining, instead of defending, instead of softening, you're building something they can't break. A spouse who's used to interrogating you about every detail of your day will push back harder when you start answering vaguely. They're used to extraction. They're used to access. When you close the door, they don't like it. They might become angry. They might accuse you of shutting them out. They might weaponize it. But here's what's true. You're not shutting them out. You're establishing that your inner world is yours. That you get to decide what you share and what you don't. That's not coldness. That's health. The repetition that anchors this. My private world is not open for inspection. Say it. Write it. This becomes your internal mantra. Every time someone asks you something personal and you feel the urge to answer, my private world is not open for inspection. Every time you feel pressure to explain yourself, my private world is not open for inspection. This is what keeps you from collapsing under the pressure that will come. Because pressure will come. When you stop being available for inspection, people notice immediately. They don't like it. Their instinct is to push harder, to find the angle that works to wear you down. A parent who's used to knowing everything about your life will become aggressive when you stop updating them. A friend who's used to being your emotional dump will become distant and then hostile when you stop processing your entire life with them. An employer who's used to unrestricted access to your time will push harder when you start protecting your boundaries. This is where most people break. They start using silence and then the pushback comes and it hurts and they crack. They go back to explaining. They go back to being available. They go back to the old pattern because the discomfort of the pushback is worse than the discomfort of the invasion. Don't do that. The pushback is temporary. The invasion is permanent if you allow it. Now here's how you actually do this. You need what I call the emergency response framework. This is how you separate genuine emergencies from manipulation disguised as urgency. Because people will try to create false urgency to break your boundaries. They'll say things like, "We need to talk about this right now," or "I deserve to know," or "How can you not tell me?" These are pressure tactics. They're not emergencies. An actual emergency is limited and specific. A boundary violation disguised as urgency is constant and expanding. When you encounter a question you don't want to answer, or a situation where someone is pushing for information, you need a framework that's so boring, so repetitive, so unchanging that it becomes your armor. Create 3-word responses. That's it. 3 words. I'll handle it. Not discussing this. We're good. That's all you need. These responses are boring. They're not interesting. They don't invite further dialogue. They're just facts stated plainly. Practice these until they feel completely natural. Until you can say them without any softening in your voice. Without any apology. Without any space for negotiation. When someone pushes back, you repeat the same sentence. Not a variation. Not a different explanation. The exact same words. Every single time. Repetition is your anchor. Repetition is boring. And boring is powerful because it exhausts the other person's ability to engage. Let's be concrete. A family member constantly asks about your finances. They want to know how much you make. They want to know how you spend it. They want access to your financial life because they've decided it's their business. The old version of you explains. You justify your spending. You defend your choices. You're seeking their approval of how you manage your money. The new version is different. They ask about your finances. You say that's handled. They push. They say, but I'm just asking because I care. You say, that's handled. They try a different angle. They say, you never tell me anything anymore. You say, that's handled. Exact same words. Every time. You're not being mean. You're not being cold. You're being clear. This territory is not open. That's handled. Period. After a while, something shifts. They stop asking because they know the answer isn't changing. Your boundary has become real. It's become enforced. It's become the new normal. And eventually, and this is important, they respect it more than they respected your willingness to explain. Because respecting a boundary is respecting a person's autonomy. And autonomy is what creates respect. But this only works if you never break. If you answer one question in full, if you provide one lengthy explanation, if you soften one time, you've signaled that the boundary is negotiable. You're back to square one. The boundary only works if it's absolute. If it's boring, if it never changes, if it's protected by silence so complete that people stop trying to break through. This is what it means to use silence as a weapon. Not as avoidance, not as passive aggression, but as an active choice to protect what's yours. Your time, your energy, your inner world, your peace. All of it deserves protection. And the only tool strong enough to protect it is strategic, boring, absolute silence. You've learned that silence is a boundary. You've learned that pushback is proof that the boundary is working. You've learned the emergency response framework that makes boundaries unbreakable. You're not just learning to be quiet. You're learning to be untouchable. To build a private world so protected that people stop even trying to invade it. But here's what comes next. Because building these boundaries, maintaining this silence, protecting your peace, it requires something most people don't have. It requires an internal foundation so solid that external pressure doesn't penetrate it. You need to know, at your core, that you're right to protect yourself. That you're right to stay silent. That you're right to refuse access. That knowledge has to come from somewhere inside you. And right now, for most of you, it doesn't exist yet. We're going to build it. Because the walls you build with silence are only as strong as the conviction that built them. Without that conviction, without that internal certainty, the walls crumble the moment real pressure arrives. Chapter 4. The Power of Strategic Listening. Why listening more than you speak becomes invisible. Authority. Most people think leadership is about talking, about having the right answers, about speaking with authority and conviction. They're wrong. The most powerful people in any room are the ones who say the least. And the reason isn't what you think. When you don't speak much, something happens in the minds of the people around you. They project intelligence onto you. They assume you're thinking deeply about things. They assume you understand dimensions of the problem they don't see. They assume you know something they don't know. And here's the critical part. This assumption becomes reality in their minds. It doesn't matter if it's true. What matters is that they believe it. Now compare this to the person who talks constantly. That person is perceived differently. People assume they're defensive. They assume anxiety is driving the speech. They assume the constant talking is a sign that the person needs validation. They assume the person is reacting instead of thinking. And guess what? That assumption also becomes reality. Not because it's necessarily true, but because assumptions create perception, and perception creates behavior. You don't have to be smarter than everyone in the room. You just have to appear like you're processing information instead of spilling it. That's the only difference. Silence creates that appearance. Silence makes you look like you're thinking. And when people think you're thinking, they treat you like a thinker. That's the whole game. This is invisible authority. It's not about formal position. It's not about credentials. It's about the perception that you know something. The perception that you're discerning. The perception that you're in control. All of that comes from your willingness to stay silent while everyone else is talking. It's a superpower that nobody teaches you because most people don't understand it. Think about the people you genuinely respect. The real authorities in your life. The ones whose opinions actually matter to you. How much do they talk? Probably not very much. They don't fill silence with noise. They don't feel compelled to contribute to every conversation. When they speak, people listen. Not because they're loud. Because they're rare. Because every word matters because they don't waste words. Now think about the people nobody respects. The ones whose opinions don't matter. How much do they talk? They talk constantly. They're in every conversation. They've got something to say about everything. And the more they talk, the less people listen. Because talking constantly signals that you don't have anything important to say. If you did, you'd be more selective about when you speak. This is the inverse relationship most people never understand. The more you talk, the less authority you have. The less you talk, the more authority you accumulate. It's not complicated. It's just counterintuitive to the way you've been trained. Here's what actually happens when you stay silent. There's a vacuum. That vacuum is uncomfortable for most people. Their instinct is to fill it. So they talk, they explain, they justify, they elaborate. And while they're doing all that, you're listening. You're gathering information. You're understanding their insecurities, their fears, their weaknesses, their plans. You're becoming more informed about them than they are about you. This is asymmetrical power. In any negotiation, professional, personal, romantic, anything, the person who speaks less knows more. They hold the advantage. They understand the other person's position better than they understand yours. Your silence forces them to reveal themselves while you remain protected. A business meeting. Two people presenting competing ideas. One person talks the entire time. They explain their perspective repeatedly. They add context. They defend their position. They're anxious, so they keep talking. The other person asks questions and listens. They don't interrupt. They don't jump in to defend their position. They just listen. Ask another question. Listen some more. Who does the room perceive as the expert? The quiet person. The one who's asking questions. Even if the quiet person knows less, they're perceived as knowing more because they're listening instead of talking. They're thinking instead of reacting. The moment you flip that dynamic, you flip the power in the room. That's not magic. That's just how human perception works. And here's the thing about the information you gather through listening. It's yours to keep. You know their fears. You know their insecurities. You know what drives them. You know what they care about. You know their vulnerabilities. They know almost nothing about you. You're the repository of truth. They're the open book. And in any interaction that matters, the person holding information holds power. Most people never learn this because they're too busy talking to notice it. They're so focused on being heard that they don't realize listening is what makes you powerful. Silence is what makes you dangerous. Strategic listening isn't passive. It's the most active form of leadership there is. You're gathering intelligence. You're identifying vulnerabilities. You're understanding systems. You're preparing. And nobody can see you doing it because you're just sitting there, quiet, listening. Now let's make this practical, because understanding it intellectually isn't enough. You need a framework. Here's the practice. When someone is speaking, stop doing what you probably do right now. Stop planning your response while they're talking. Stop mentally preparing your rebuttal. Stop thinking about what you're going to say next. Actually listen to what they're saying. Hear their words. Understand their position. Let them finish. Then, and this is the critical part, wait 3 full seconds before responding. 3 seconds of silence. That's it. But those 3 seconds do 2 things simultaneously. First, they make the other person think you're considering their words deeply. They think you're processing. They think you're taking them seriously. They think you're thinking. Second, you actually are processing. Because you're not in reaction mode. You're in consideration mode. You're actually thinking about what they said instead of reacting to it. Your response will have more authority because you're not reacting. You're responding. That's the entire difference. The repetition that embeds this. My silence is gathering intelligence. My silence is strategic. Say it. Own it. Every time you feel the urge to jump in and talk, every time you feel the pressure to fill the silence, every time your anxiety wants you to contribute to the conversation, my silence is gathering intelligence. My silence is strategic because that's the truth. Your silence isn't emptiness. It's not absence. It's presence. It's power. It's work. You're working while you're silent. You're gathering intelligence. You're understanding dynamics. You're identifying leverage points. You're preparing. And that preparation is invisible to everyone watching. They just see you sitting there, listening, and they assume you're wise. This is what it looks like to weaponize listening. Not to be strategic in a manipulative way, but to understand that communication is power, and silence is the most powerful form of communication available to you. When you listen more than you speak, you become the person everyone wants to know. You become the person whose opinion matters. You become the person in control of the room without ever raising your voice. You've learned that silence creates the perception of wisdom. You've learned that listening gives you information advantage over everyone else. You've learned the 3-second practice that converts listening into authority. You're not just learning to shut up. You're learning to use your silence as a tool for power and perception. But here's what you need to know. Strategic listening only works if you have conviction behind it. If you're silent because you're afraid, people sense that. If you're quiet because you don't know what to say, people perceive weakness. But if you're silent because you're choosing to be selective about your words, if you're listening because you're gathering information strategically, if your silence comes from internal certainty rather than internal doubt, that's when it works. That's when people respond. You need to know at your core that your words matter. That your silence is chosen, not forced. That you don't need to defend yourself so you don't. That conviction changes everything. Chapter 5. Master the Uncomfortable Pause. How to weaponize silence in conversation without appearing cold. You're about to learn the most practical skill in this book. Not because it's complicated, because it's so simple that most people completely miss it. It's a 3 to 5 second pause. That's it. 3 to 5 seconds of silence in a conversation. But that pause is going to change everything about how people perceive you, how they respond to you, and how much power you hold in any interaction. The pause is taught wrong in every communication class you've ever taken. You've been told that silence in conversation is awkward, that you need to fill it immediately, that pausing makes you seem uncertain or confused, that a good communicator keeps the conversation flowing smoothly. All of that is backwards. All of that is designed to keep you small. Here's the truth. When you pause before speaking, you signal something very specific. You signal that you're not impulsive. You signal that your words matter enough to be preceded by thought. You signal that you're considering what you're about to say instead of just reacting. It's the opposite of cold. It's deliberate. It's intentional. And intention creates respect. Think about the most powerful people you know. The ones whose words actually land. Watch them in conversation. They don't rush to fill silence. They pause. They think, then they speak. And when they speak, people listen, because they've signaled through that pause that what they're about to say is worth waiting for. That's the whole dynamic. Now think about the people nobody listens to. They jump in immediately. They don't pause. They're always reacting. They're always filling space. And because they're always doing that, their words have no weight. They're just noise. The difference between the two isn't intelligence. It's the pause. When someone asks you something important, stop your instinct to answer immediately. Pause. 3 to 5 seconds. That's all. This pause does 3 things simultaneously. First, it makes your response seem more important. The other person thinks, if they took time to consider this, it must be worth hearing. Second, it gives you actual time to think instead of react. You're not scrambling for an answer. You're formulating a response. Third, it signals that you're not desperate to please them with an immediate answer. You don't need their approval so badly that you jump to respond. You have the luxury of thinking first. That third point is the power point. The moment someone realizes you're not desperately seeking their approval, the entire dynamic shifts. You're not begging to be liked. You're not performing. You're just thinking. And that self-sufficiency is magnetic. Now let's make this granular because execution matters. There are different types of pauses. They're designed for different situations. And mastering them is what separates people who appear strong from people who actually are strong. The clarification pause. Someone makes a claim. They state something as fact. Your instinct is to respond to that claim. Challenge it or agree with it. Don't. Instead, pause for 2 to 3 seconds. Then ask a single question, not multiple questions. 1. You're asking for more specificity. You're saying, I heard what you said, and before I respond, I need more information. This accomplishes 2 things. You appear thoughtful because you're asking questions instead of reacting, and you're controlling the conversation because the other person is now answering your questions instead of defending their claim. That's power, the refusal pause. Someone makes a request of you. They want something. Your old instinct is to immediately explain why you can't do it, to defend yourself, to make sure they understand your reasoning. Don't do that anymore. Pause for 3 to 5 seconds. Then say no. No explanation. That's it. The pause before the refusal signals that you've considered their request and decided against it. It signals respect for them and for yourself. You're not being rude. You're being clear. The pause is what prevents it from sounding harsh. It's what shows that you've thought about it and decided. When you add explanation, you're asking them to understand. When you just say no after a pause, you're not asking for anything. You're just deciding, the reflection pause. Someone shares something with you. They tell you about their struggle or their plan or their fear. Your instinct is to solve it, to give advice, to fix it for them. That's not your job. Your job is different. Pause for 2 to 3 seconds. Then acknowledge one specific thing they said. Not everything. One thing. You're reflecting what you heard. You're not solving, advising, or fixing. You're just understanding back to them. This pause before reflecting signals that you're taking their words seriously. That you're not just waiting for your turn to talk. That you actually heard them. The reflection without advice is more powerful than any advice could be. Let's be concrete with a real scenario. Your boss asks why a project is behind. Your old instinct fires immediately. You jump in. You explain. You defend. You provide context. Your boss is now hearing a stream of justification. They're thinking you're making excuses. The new version. Your boss asks why the project is behind. You pause for 4 full seconds. You look at them. You breathe. Then you respond. It required more resources than we allocated. You stop. You don't add anything. You don't explain further. You don't soften it. You don't provide context unless they ask. You just stated the fact. The pause before made them expect something important. Your answer delivered that importance. You didn't apologize. You didn't over-explain. You just answered. The pause creates respect because it signals that you're not panicking. You're not desperate to convince them. You're just dealing with facts. The power in that scenario isn't the answer. The power is in the pause before the answer and the silence after. You've trained them that when you speak, it matters. That you're not filling space. That you're delivering information, not seeking approval. Here's what's happening in the other person's brain during that pause. They're getting uncomfortable. Silence is uncomfortable for most people. Their instinct is to fill it, but they can't because you're holding it. They're sitting in their own discomfort. And that discomfort is working in your favor. It's making them wonder what you're going to say. It's making them take what you're about to say more seriously. The pause is a tool, and you're using it. Now here's the critical part. You can't jump into high-stakes situations and master this overnight. You need practice. Low-stakes practice. You need to build the neural pathways that let you pause naturally without it feeling forced. Start with conversations that don't matter. A cashier, an acquaintance, a colleague you don't fear making a mistake with. Practice pausing. Practice saying less. Notice what happens. Notice how people respond differently when you're not filling every void. Notice how they lean in. Notice how they seem to respect you more. Notice how the conversation feels different. That's the nervous system rewiring. That's the new pattern being built. Once this becomes natural in low-stakes situations, move up. Move to conversations that matter more. Move to situations where real stakes exist. By then, the pause will be automatic. You won't have to think about it. Your body will pause naturally because it's been trained to. And that's when it becomes truly powerful. That's when it's no longer a technique. It's just who you are. The repetition that embeds this. My pause is not weakness. My pause is precision. Say it, write it, live it. Every time you feel the urge to jump in immediately, every time you feel the pressure to fill the silence, every time your anxiety wants you to answer right away, my pause is not weakness. My pause is precision. Because that's what it is. The pause is you being precise with your words. It's you refusing to be sloppy. It's you deciding that what you say matters and therefore deserves thought. You've learned that pausing before speaking signals respect for your words. You've learned the 3 types of pauses and when to use them. You've learned the practice that makes pausing natural. You're not just learning to be slower. You're learning to be strategic with the most powerful tool you have, your presence. But here's what's coming. Because mastering the pause in conversation is one thing, learning to use silence as a complete communication system is another. Because sometimes the most powerful communication isn't pausing before you speak. It's not speaking at all. It's knowing when to walk away, when to leave a situation, when to let silence do the entire work. That's a different level, and you're ready for it. Chapter 6. Say no without explanation. The single most powerful word in the silent strategy. You're about to learn the single most liberating word in the English language. And it's going to terrify you at first. Because you've been trained your entire life to be afraid of it, to apologize when you use it, to soften it, to add explanation, to make sure the other person understands and approves of it. Stop. The word is no. And it's a complete sentence. No, that's it. No needs nothing else. No needs no companion words. No needs no justification. No needs no explanation. You say it and you stop talking. That's the entire strategy. But I know that sounds impossible to you right now because you've been conditioned to believe that saying no requires explanation. That being a good person means explaining your rejection. That you owe people access to your reasoning? You don't. You owe them nothing. You've been taught to soften your rejections your entire life. No, but I could maybe... Translation, my no is negotiable. No, because I'm busy and... Translation, if I wasn't busy, the answer would be yes. No, I really wish I could... Translation, I feel bad about this rejection and I need you to know I didn't want to say no. All of these are apologies disguised as answers. All of them signal that your no is open for discussion. People who maintain real power don't do this. They don't soften. They don't explain. They say no and they remain silent when questioned. They let the no stand alone. They understand something fundamental. The moment you add explanation to your no, you transform it from a boundary into a negotiation. You've just invited them to engage. You've just opened the door to discussion. You've just signaled that your answer might change if they push hard enough. That's not how this works anymore. Here's what a clear no sounds like. Someone asks you for something. You say no. They ask why. You say, I'm not interested. They push. You say, that's not going to work for me. They push again. You say no, same word. Exact same response. You're not varying your answer. You're not getting frustrated. You're not raising your voice. You're not explaining. You're just repeating the boundary. And with each repetition, you're showing them that it's immovable. This is what it looks like to be unshakable. Not by being loud or aggressive, but by being absolutely consistent and absolutely unwilling to negotiate on something you've decided. Your no is not up for discussion. Your no is not contingent on their persuasion. Your no is final. And they need to learn that. The problem is, most people have never experienced someone who maintains their no like this. So when they encounter it, they escalate. This is the escalation pattern, and you need to understand it so you don't break when it arrives. First, they'll push once. It's subtle. They ask again or they rephrase the question. Your response, you repeat your no. Not a different answer. The same no. No, that's all. Second push. They get more direct. Maybe they ask why, or they express surprise that you're saying no. You stay silent for a moment. Then you respond, I'm not available for this. Or you simply repeat no. Third push. This is where it gets harder. They get frustrated, maybe angry. They try manipulation. They say things like, why not? That doesn't make sense. They're trying to break through your boundary by making you feel like you need to explain yourself. Don't fall for it. You stay silent or you repeat, I've decided not to. No elaboration, no justification, no apology. The discomfort you feel at this moment is the critical juncture. You're going to feel like you're being rude. You're going to feel like you're being mean. You're going to feel like you owe them explanation. You don't. You're setting a boundary. Boundaries feel uncomfortable when you're not used to having them. But the discomfort is the proof that the boundary is working. If it didn't feel uncomfortable, they'd still be pushing. After the third or fourth rejection without explanation, something shifts. They stop pushing. They realize your no is not negotiable. They realize you're not going to cave. They realize that pushing harder isn't going to change your answer. And in that moment, they actually respect you more for it, because you've shown them something they rarely see, a person who knows what they want and who doesn't apologize for it. Let's make this concrete, because abstraction isn't going to help you when you're actually in these situations. Someone asks to borrow money from you. Your instinct is to help, but you've decided no, so you say no. They ask why. Your old answer would be, because I need it, or because I'm worried you won't pay me back. Stop. Those explanations are apologies. They're you justifying your boundary. They're signaling that your no is negotiable if they can address your concerns. The new version, they ask to borrow money. You say no. They ask why. You say, I've decided not to. That's it. You're not explaining. You're not defending. You're not providing a reason that could be argued against. You're just stating that you've decided, and a decision doesn't need justification. If they push again, you don't add more explanation. You add silence. You let them sit with their discomfort. You let them feel what it's like to ask for something and get a clear no, without any hope of negotiation. Most people will eventually accept it and move on. Some will get angry. Let them. Your boundary isn't their comfort. It's yours. A colleague asks you to take on extra work. You're already overloaded. You say no. They say, but nobody else can do it. You say, not my problem. You don't explain that you're overloaded. You don't list all the things you're already doing. You don't justify your no. You just state it. Your workload is not their business. Your reasons for saying no are not their business. They asked. You answered. The conversation is over. A family member asks you to change your plans to accommodate theirs. You've already made your decision. You say, no, I'm not available. They push. They ask why. They express hurt. They suggest you don't care. You stay silent. Or you say, my plans are set. That's all. You're not explaining your plans. You're not validating their hurt. You're not compromising. You're just being clear. This is going to feel cold at first. It's going to feel like you're being unkind. That's because you've been taught that explaining yourself is kindness. It's not. Explaining yourself is actually unkind because it signals that your boundary might move if they push hard enough. It gives them false hope. It encourages them to push harder. It ultimately creates more pain. The kind thing is to be clear, to say no and mean it, to let them know that this boundary is immovable so they can adjust their expectations accordingly. The repetition that embeds this, no is not negotiable. No needs no explanation. Say it, write it, live it. Every time you feel the urge to explain your no, every time you feel pressure to justify your boundary, every time someone pushes and your instinct is to add explanation, no is not negotiable. No needs no explanation. Now here's the practice that makes this real. For the next week, practice saying no to 3 small things. A text message asking you to do something. A request at work. A social invitation. Nothing huge. Small things. Say no without explanation. Don't soften it. Don't add, maybe. Don't apologize. Just say no. Feel the discomfort. Sit with it. Realize you're alive. Realize the world didn't end. Realize nothing bad actually happened. The people who respect you will adjust. The people who don't respect your boundaries will get upset. Let them be upset. That's their work, not yours. The repetition that embeds this practice. My boundaries are not open for discussion. When someone pushes back on your no, when someone tries to negotiate, when someone expresses hurt or anger, my boundaries are not open for discussion. That becomes your anchor. Your decision about what you will and won't do isn't a topic of conversation. It's not something you negotiate. It's just the reality of how you operate. You've learned that no is a complete sentence. You've learned that adding explanation transforms a boundary into a negotiation. You've learned the escalation pattern and how to stay firm through it. You've learned the practice that makes no natural. You're not just learning to refuse requests. You're learning to own your life so completely that you don't apologize for how you live it. But here's what comes next. Because knowing how to say no is one level of power, knowing when to say no is another. Because not every request requires the same treatment. Some things deserve more consideration. Some situations have nuance. You need to learn how to distinguish between the moments where no is final and the moments where no is strategic. Where sometimes saying no isn't about refusal. It's about timing. It's about making the other person earn your yes instead of assuming it's available. That's a different layer, and you're ready to step into it. Chapter 7. The words you must eliminate. 7 verbal habits that destroy your authority in real time. There are words you're using right now that are sabotaging you. Not metaphorically, literally. Every time you speak them, you're dismantling the authority you're trying to build. And the worst part is you don't even realize you're doing it. These words feel natural. They feel polite. They feel safe. They're not. They're weapons pointed at yourself. You need to eliminate them, not eventually. Now. Today. Because every conversation you have while you're still using these words is reinforcing the pattern that you're not worth listening to. That your words need softening. That you need permission to speak. Let's start with the most destructive qualifier words. I think, maybe, possibly. Just, these 4 words appear constantly in your speech, and they're destroying you in real time. I think we should.
That's what you say.
Here's what you should say instead. We should. Do you feel the difference? One is a suggestion. One is a statement. One is seeking approval. One is declaring direction. The word I think tells everyone in the room that you're not confident in what you're about to say. You're inviting them to disagree. You're signaling that this is your opinion, not a fact. And opinions are debatable. Facts are not. Now multiply this across your entire day. How many times do you start sentences with I think? In meetings, in conversations, in emails. You're constantly broadcasting uncertainty. And people respond to that broadcast. They discount you. They question you. They treat your words as less important because you've signaled they are. Maybe I'm wrong, but stop. You're already apologizing before you've even stated your position. You're saying, I know this might not be right, but here it is anyway. You're begging for acceptance while simultaneously saying something. That's not communication. That's performing uncertainty. Here's what's true instead of maybe I'm wrong. Just state what you believe. If you're wrong, you'll find out. But you don't need to announce your potential wrongness in advance. That's just you policing yourself before anyone else gets the chance to. Possibly we could explore. No. Here's what we're exploring. You're not asking for permission to explore. You're not suggesting we consider the possibility. You're declaring what you're doing. The moment you use possibly, you've weakened your position. You've made it optional. You've suggested that this is just one idea among many equally valid ideas. That's not leadership. That's democracy. And you don't need everyone's vote on everything. I'm just saying. This phrase kills everything it precedes. You're already apologizing for what you're about to say. You're signaling that it's not important. You're begging forgiveness for speaking. Stop. If what you're about to say is worth saying, you don't need to apologize for it. Say it, own it. Don't wrap it in this defensive qualifier. These qualifier words are permission requests disguised as speech. They telegraph uncertainty before you've even finished your sentence. They announce that you're not confident in what you're about to say, and people hear this. They take it as information. They think, if the person speaking doesn't believe in what they're saying, why should I? That's not unfair. That's just how human perception works. A study on gender and speech patterns found something remarkable. People who eliminated these qualifiers from their speech were promoted faster. They were perceived as more competent. They were remembered as idea makers instead of idea contributors. The same people, the same intelligence. The only variable was the words they used. That's the power we're talking about here. Think about this in a meeting. A woman speaks up and says, "I think maybe we should consider looking at this possibility." The room hears 5 qualifiers in one sentence. Her idea is now buried under layers of uncertainty. A man in the same meeting says, "Here's what we need to do." Same core idea. Completely different reception. The man is remembered as the person who solved the problem. The woman is remembered as someone who offered a thought. Both had the same insight. Different words. Different outcomes. Now let's talk about the second destructive habit. You apologize for existing. Sorry I'm late. Sorry to bother you. Sorry, could I say something? You're signaling that your presence is an inconvenience. That your voice takes something from others. That you're occupying space you don't deserve. You're apologizing for existing. And every time you do it, you're reinforcing the belief that you don't belong. Stop. You're not sorry you're late. You're late, state it. I'll be there at 3:15. You're not sorry to bother anyone. You have something to say. State it. I have something to add. You're not sorry for speaking. You need to communicate. State it. Here's what I need. You're not being rude when you do this. You're being clear. You're not being cold. You're being efficient. You're not being selfish. You're respecting people's time by being direct instead of performing apology. The repetition that embeds this. I stop apologizing for my presence. Say it, write it. Every time you feel the urge to start with sorry, every time you feel the need to apologize for existing or speaking or taking up space, I stop apologizing for my presence. Because that's what's happening. You're apologizing for a right you already have, the right to exist and to speak. But here's where it gets practical. Because understanding these concepts intellectually isn't enough. You need to replace the words you're eliminating with power words. Words that declare instead of request. Words that state instead of suggest. Instead of, I'm not sure, you say, I need more information. Different meaning. One sounds tentative. One sounds like you're gathering intelligence. Instead of that's probably fine, you say that works. Instead of I hope you don't mind, you say here's what I need. Instead of maybe we could, you say we will. Instead of I'm just checking in, you say I'm checking in. These aren't minor word swaps. They're complete rewires of how you position yourself in language. You're moving from someone who suggests and hopes and apologizes to someone who states and decides and acts. Create a personal lexicon. Write down the power words you're going to use, the phrases that feel like you, the vocabulary that sounds like someone who believes in themselves. Then use them repeatedly. Don't just use them once. Use them until they feel natural. In 2 weeks, your speech pattern will shift fundamentally. And here's what's remarkable. People will treat you differently. Not because you're different people, because you're speaking like someone who believes in themselves. A boss hears you say we will instead of maybe we could. Suddenly you sound more reliable. A colleague hears you say, here's what I need instead of I hope this isn't too much to ask. Suddenly you sound more competent. A client hears you say I need more information instead of I'm not sure. Suddenly you sound like an expert. The only variable is the words you used. Everything else about you stayed the same. The repetition that embeds this replacement vocabulary. My words are declarations, not requests. This is your anchor. Every time you're tempted to soften your speech, every time you're tempted to add qualifiers, every time you're tempted to apologize for speaking, my words are declarations, not requests. Because that's the fundamental shift happening. You're moving from a linguistic posture of requesting to a linguistic posture of declaring. You're no longer asking for permission through your words. You're stating facts. You're announcing decisions. You're communicating like someone who has authority. And the remarkable thing is, when you communicate like someone with authority, people respond to you as if you have authority. The words you use are training wheels, or they're training your brain. Right now, they're training wheels. They're holding you up at the level of the person who needs validation. The moment you eliminate them, you flip the script. You're training your brain to believe in yourself. You're training your nervous system to speak with certainty. You're training the people around you to listen when you speak because you're speaking like it matters. You've learned the 7 words that destroy your authority. You've learned why people who eliminate them are promoted faster and perceived as more competent. You've learned that your apologies are training people to think of you as an inconvenience. You've learned the replacement vocabulary that positions you as someone who declares instead of requests. You're not just changing words. You're changing the neural pathways that underlie them. But here's the deeper truth. Words are only the surface. Beneath the words is something more fundamental. The actual belief in yourself. The actual conviction that you deserve to take up space. The actual knowledge that your opinion matters. Because if you don't have that, if you're still seeking approval at your core, the power words will sound hollow. They'll sound like performance. And people sense performance. They see through it. You need to build something underneath the words. Something that's immovable. Something that doesn't depend on how you sound, but on who you actually are. Because the strongest version of you isn't someone with perfect speech. It's someone who speaks from a place of unshakable certainty. Chapter 8. Silence in conflict. Never defend what doesn't need defense. This chapter is about the moment where everything you've learned gets tested. The moment where you're attacked, where someone challenges you, where conflict arrives, and your instinct fires to defend, to explain, to prove them wrong, to convince them, and this is where most people lose everything they've built. You need to understand something fundamental about conflict. The moment you argue, you've already lost. Not because your position is weak, not because they're right, but because you've accepted their framework. You've accepted that this is a debate, that there are 2 sides, that something needs to be proven. You've stepped into their game, and their game is designed to keep you defending, explaining, justifying forever. Stop playing. The most powerful response to an attack is non-engagement. You don't argue back. You don't explain yourself. You don't prove them wrong. You don't provide evidence that they misunderstood. You do nothing. Or you acknowledge their statement and move on. I hear you. Then you're done. You've ended the game before it started. The person attacking you is fishing. They're looking for engagement. They want to fight because a fight gives them what they want. Access to your attention, your energy, your mental space. Silence starves that. When you don't engage, the fight has no fuel. It can't continue. They can attack, but if nobody's defending, there's no battle. This feels counterintuitive. Your instinct is that silence equals agreement. That if you don't defend yourself, people will think you're wrong. They'll think you're guilty. They'll think you don't have a good answer. That's not how it works. Silence creates mystery. When you don't engage with accusations, people don't assume you're guilty. They assume you're so confident in your position that you don't need to defend it. Let's be concrete. Someone criticizes your work. In a meeting, in front of people. Your old instinct fires immediately. You spend 20 minutes explaining why they're wrong. You explain the context. You explain what they misunderstood. You explain your reasoning. You're now frustrated. You're tired. You're emotionally spent. And they still don't believe you. Nothing you said changed their mind because their mind was closed before you started explaining. Here's the alternative. Someone criticizes your work. You pause. You say, I appreciate the feedback. Then you're done. You don't explain. You don't defend. You don't prove anything to anyone. You've acknowledged their statement and moved on. And something remarkable happens. The person criticizing you doesn't know what to do. They were expecting a fight. They got acceptance. They expected defense. They got acknowledgement. The dynamic doesn't exist anymore. Sometimes they'll try to restart it. They'll push. They'll demand you explain yourself. You still don't. You stay silent or you repeat. That's your perspective. You're not engaging. You're not defending. You're just existing in your choice, and their aggression has no target. This is what non-engagement looks like in practice. It's not passivity. It's not avoidance. It's active disengagement from a game you didn't start and don't need to play. You're saying, I'm not entering this framework. I'm not accepting your premise. I'm moving forward regardless of what you think about my work. That clarity is more powerful than any defense could be. Now let's understand what's happening in the other person's brain during this. When you don't defend yourself, people create their own narratives to fill the void. Sometimes they assume you didn't hear them. Sometimes they assume you're so confident that you don't need to defend. Sometimes they assume you're above the argument. All of these outcomes are better than entering a defensive debate. You've stopped being the defendant and become something else. The mysterious one. The unshakable one. The one with nothing to prove. That's power. Real power. Not because you've convinced them, but because you've removed yourself from the situation where they get to judge you. You've made it clear that their judgment doesn't change your course. Their opinion doesn't shake your decisions. Their attacks don't trigger your defense. That's what creates respect.
Not agreement.
Not approval. Respect for someone who can't be moved. A family member attacks your life choices. Your marriage. Your career. Your parenting. In the old version, you defend. You explain your reasoning. You try to help them understand. You list all the reasons why you're making the right decision, and nothing changes because they don't want to understand. They want to win the argument. The new version, they attack. You say, I'm done discussing this. Then you're silent. They push. You repeat, I'm done discussing this. They get angry. You stay silent. Not cold silence. Just the silence of someone who has made a decision and doesn't need their approval to execute it. After a while, something shifts. They realize they can't move you. They can't win. They can't get you to defend yourself into exhaustion. So they stop trying. And in that moment, they often respect you more than they would have if you'd won a debate. The repetition that embeds this, I don't defend. I don't explain. I move forward. Say it. Write it. This becomes your mantra in conflict. Every time you feel the urge to defend, every time you feel the pressure to explain yourself, every time you want to prove someone wrong, I don't defend. I don't explain. I move forward. That's your anchor. That's what keeps you out of the trap. Now here's the practical framework for the moments when you absolutely must respond to conflict. Because sometimes staying completely silent isn't possible. Sometimes work situations or family situations require you to say something. In those moments, you need specific phrases. Phrases that end the conversation. Phrases that don't invite further debate. First phrase, I'm not going to litigate this. That's it. You're saying, this is not a conversation where truth is being decided. We're not in a courtroom. We're not going to go back and forth until someone wins. I'm not going to litigate this. Say it once. Don't repeat. If they push back, you go silent. Your silence is your final word. It says, I've stated my boundary, and I'm not moving from it. Second phrase, that's your interpretation. Someone makes an accusation. They claim you said something you didn't or did something you didn't. You say, that's your interpretation. You're not defending. You're not explaining. You're not saying they're wrong. You're just acknowledging that they have an interpretation and moving on. It's an acknowledgement without engagement. It's a way of saying, you have your perspective, and I have mine, and we're done discussing it. Third phrase, I'm done with this conversation. The most powerful statement of all. You're not angry when you say it. You're not emotional. You're just clear. The conversation is over. If they continue talking, you don't respond. You don't say it again. You've said it. Anything after that is your silence. And your silence means it's finished. Practice these phrases until they're automatic. Write them down. Say them out loud. Repeat them until your nervous system knows exactly what to say in the moment when conflict arrives. Because when conflict arrives, you don't want to be thinking about what to say. You want your body to know. Your nervous system to activate the phrase automatically. That's when it works. That's when you don't slip into the old pattern of defending and explaining. When conflict hits and your adrenaline is up and your instinct is firing to defend. You need the phrase to be so automatic that you don't have to think. Your body just delivers it. I'm not going to litigate this. That's your interpretation. I'm done with this conversation. Then silence. That's your entire toolkit for conflict. And it's more powerful than any argument you could ever win. Because here's the truth about winning arguments. You don't actually win them by being right. You win them by refusing to argue. You don't actually convince people by explaining. You convince them by being unwilling to be convinced otherwise. You don't prove your worth through defense. You prove it through non-defense. Through the clarity that you don't need anyone's approval to know you're right. You've learned that the moment you argue, you've lost. You've learned that the most powerful response to an attack is non-engagement. You've learned that silence creates respect, not weakness. You've learned the 3 phrases that end conflict without further engagement. You're not just learning to handle conflict better. You're learning to remove yourself from conflict entirely by refusing to play the game. But here's the deeper challenge. Because using these techniques requires something underneath them. It requires actual conviction that you don't need to defend yourself. If you're using these phrases from a place of fear, if you're going silent because you're afraid to speak, it won't work. People sense that. The moment someone realizes you're scared, your techniques become transparent. You need to build something real underneath these words. Something that's not performance. Something that's actual belief. Because the strongest version of silence isn't technique. It's truth. It's someone who knows they're right and doesn't need to convince anyone else. That person's silence is genuinely powerful because it comes from actual conviction, not from learned tactics. That conviction is built. It's not given. And you're about to learn how to build it. Chapter 9. Build your silent reputation, how the quiet ones become the most respected people in the room. You're at a point now where you understand the mechanics. You know how to stop explaining. You know how to stay silent. You know how to use pauses and boundaries. But understanding the mechanics is not the same as building the reputation. And that's what this chapter is about. How to take everything you've learned and turn it into something that precedes you. Something that people feel when you walk into a room. That something is reputation. And reputation is built on something very specific. It's not built on volume. It's not built on visibility. It's built on consistency. People remember the person who's consistently calm more than they remember the person who's consistently talkative. Not by a small margin, by a massive margin. In workplaces, in families, in friend groups. The person who stays steady while everyone else is losing their minds becomes the person everyone remembers. The person everyone respects. People trust the person who speaks rarely and accurately more than they trust the person who speaks constantly and apologizes. That's not opinion. That's documented in research across industries. People trust precision over volume. They trust selectivity over availability. They trust the person who means what they say because they don't say very much. Your silent reputation is built by doing what you say, by staying quiet about your accomplishments, by letting your work speak instead of your words. When you talk constantly about what you're doing, you're seeking validation. You're asking people to be impressed. You're performing. When you stay silent and your results become undeniable, you're building authority. You're not asking for anything. You're just existing at a level where your results speak for themselves. Here's a concrete comparison. 2 employees at a company. Same industry. Same skill level. One constantly updates everyone on their progress. Sends emails about their wins. Talks in meetings about what they've accomplished. They're visible. They're vocal. They're reminding people constantly of their value. The other completes their work. Stays quiet. Doesn't announce their accomplishments. Just executes. Their results become legendary because people start talking about them, instead of them talking about themselves. Fast forward 5 years. The first employee is still in the same role, maybe promoted once. The second employee is being groomed for leadership. Why? Because in 5 years, people have developed a narrative about the second person. That narrative is, this is someone who produces. This is someone who doesn't need external validation. This is someone who knows their worth. That narrative becomes reality. People start including them in conversations about the future. They're consulted on decisions. They're trusted in high-stakes situations, not because they're more competent, but because they've built a reputation of competence through silence. The first employee is still working for it, still proving it, still announcing it, still seeking validation, and people respond to that seeking. They see the neediness, and neediness doesn't command respect. It commands pity. This is the key difference between building a reputation on volume and building it on silence. One requires constant maintenance. You have to keep talking. You have to keep reminding people. You have to keep performing. The other builds on itself. The less you talk, the more your silence works for you. The more people fill in the blanks with their own narrative of who you are. And that narrative, built by them, is more powerful than anything you could have told them. Now let's talk about selective communication. This is where reputation building gets sophisticated. You don't communicate with everyone. You don't share your challenges, your dreams, your vulnerabilities with people who haven't earned that access. You communicate when necessary. You stay silent when it's not necessary. This selectivity builds mystique, and people respect what they don't fully understand. When you're an open book, there's nothing left to wonder about. People know everything about you. Your struggles, your fears, your insecurities, your plans, and once they know everything, they lose interest. You become predictable, boring. When you're selective, people want access to you. They try harder to know you. They respect you more because they sense there's something they don't have access to. That's mystique. That's the foundation of respect. A colleague you trust gets invited into your world. You share your challenges with them. You're vulnerable. You let them see parts of you that you don't show everyone. That creates connection. It creates loyalty. It creates a bond. But that's a choice. That's selective. You didn't share that with everyone. You chose this person. That makes the sharing mean something. If you shared like that with everyone, it would mean nothing. It would just be oversharing. It would just be you seeking emotional support from everyone. The person who shares selectively is the person who becomes the confidant. The person who people want to know. The person who has gravitational pull. Everyone wants to know what they're thinking. Everyone wants to hear what they have to say. Not because they say it often, but because they say it rarely. That rarity is what creates value. The repetition that embeds this. I choose my audience carefully. I guard my words like currency. Because that's what words are. They're currency. They have value because they're limited. The moment you start spending them freely, they lose value. They become worthless. Guard them. Choose who gets access to your words. Treat them like they matter, because they do. Here's what's remarkable about building a silent reputation. It has a compound effect. 1 month of speaking less and people won't notice much of anything. You'll feel the difference internally. You'll feel the shift in your own confidence. But externally, not much. People are still operating off the old narrative of who you are. They're still expecting you to explain. They're still waiting for you to seek validation. 3 months in, people start to notice. They start to comment on it. They say things like, "You're different. You seem more confident. You don't talk as much." At this point, the narrative is beginning to shift. People are noticing the change. They're forming new opinions. They're starting to wonder about you. 6 months in, your reputation has shifted noticeably. People are beginning to treat you differently. They listen when you speak. They respect your time. They don't interrupt you as much. They're beginning to see you as someone who's selective and therefore valuable. The compound effect is accelerating. 1 year in, you're known as the quiet one, the competent one, the person who doesn't waste words, the person who's got something figured out, the person who doesn't need to prove anything because their results speak for themselves. That reputation is now doing work for you. It's opening doors. It's creating opportunities. It's changing how people respond to you. This is not an accident. This is the compound effect of strategic silence. Small changes made consistently over time create massive results. But here's what's critical. You don't announce that you're changing. You don't tell people you're being quieter now. You don't explain that you've decided to speak less. You just change. You stay silent. You do the work. And people notice on their own timeline. The moment you announce the change, you've broken the power of it. You've made it about the change instead of about the results. You've drawn attention to your technique instead of letting your results speak for themselves. You just change. Quietly, consistently. And people adjust their perception of you as they adjust to the new reality of who you are. The repetition that embeds this compound effect. Silence compounds. Authority builds in the gaps between my words. Every time you choose not to speak, you're building authority. Every time you choose to stay quiet instead of filling the void, you're compounding that authority. Authority isn't built in moments. It's built across time. It's built in the accumulation of small decisions to speak less, to prove less, to perform less. You're not going to feel this happening in real time. You won't wake up one day and feel suddenly more authoritative. But 6 months from now, a year from now, you'll look back and realize that people treat you completely differently. That you've moved from someone seeking approval to someone who doesn't need it. That's the compound effect of silence at work. You've learned that reputation is built on consistency, not volume. You've learned that the most respected people are the ones who speak rarely and accurately. You've learned that staying quiet about your accomplishments is more powerful than announcing them. You've learned that selective communication builds mystique and respect. You've learned that silence has a compound effect that accelerates over time. You're not just learning to speak less. You're learning to build an identity where speaking less is your brand. But here's the final piece. Because a reputation is only as good as the foundation it's built on. And if that foundation is insecurity disguised as confidence, it will eventually crumble. If you're staying quiet because you're afraid to speak, people will sense that eventually. If you're being selective because you're insecure about sharing, the selectivity will feel cold and distant. Real respect doesn't come from technique. It comes from actual conviction underneath the technique. You need to know at your deepest level that your silence is powerful because you've chosen it, not because you're afraid of speech. You need to believe that your accomplishments don't need announcement because they're real. You need to feel that your worth is already established, so you don't need to prove it. That's the foundation, and everything else builds on that. Chapter 10. The Silent Life Living Authentically. When you stop performing, you've learned all the mechanics. You know how to pause. You know how to stay silent. You know how to build a reputation on selectivity. Now you're going to learn what it actually feels like when you stop performing. And this is where everything changes. Not because the techniques work better, but because you finally get your life back. Most of your speech isn't actually communication. It's performance. You're explaining your life to imaginary judges. You're defending choices no one asked you to defend. You're performing versions of yourself that exhaust you. You're trying to convince people of things nobody questions. You're living in a constant state of justification, and it's destroying you. Think about how much energy goes into this. Every explanation is energy. Every defense is energy. Every time you soften your words to make someone else comfortable, you're spending energy. Every time you overshare to make someone like you, you're spending energy. Every time you perform certainty you don't feel, you're spending energy. That energy is finite, and you're hemorrhaging it constantly. The moment you stop this performance, the moment you go silent about your private life. Your decisions, your reasoning, your beliefs, your struggles, you reclaim extraordinary energy. Energy that's been stolen from you. You don't have to be on anymore. You don't have to convince anyone. You don't have to prove your worth through words. You don't have to explain your existence to people who never asked to judge it in the first place. This is liberation. And most people never experience it because they never stop performing. They die having spent their entire lives explaining themselves to an audience that was never really paying attention. They spent their energy on an imaginary jury that didn't exist. They performed until they were empty. Here's what's remarkable. When you stop performing, you become more effective, not less. Not because you're working harder, because you're not wasting energy on the performance. A person spends 5 years telling people about their fitness journey. Every week, they're updating their friends. They're sharing their struggles. They're explaining their diet changes. They're talking about their goals. They're exhausted from the performance. From the constant updating and explaining and convincing people that yes, they're really doing this, then they stop talking about it. They go quiet. 1 year later, they've made more progress than they made in the 5 years of performance. Why? Because the energy that went into explaining has gone into doing. They're not performing anymore. They're just living. And living is infinitely more powerful than performing. But here's what happens when you go silent. People notice, and some of them won't like it, because your silence changes the dynamic they were comfortable with. They need the performance from you. They need you to be a certain way to make themselves feel better. They need your struggle to make their struggle feel validated. They need your uncertainty to make their own uncertainty feel normal. When you go silent and stop performing, you destabilize that dynamic. And they'll push back, they'll criticize you. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you're being cold or distant or mean. They'll try to pull you back into the old pattern of performing and explaining and justifying. They'll make you feel like you're doing something wrong by refusing to perform for them anymore. You're not doing anything wrong. You're reclaiming your life. The truth is, you haven't changed. You finally stopped pretending. You were never meant to be the person you were performing as. That version of you was exhausting because it wasn't real. It was a construction designed to appease people who didn't deserve your energy in the first place. When you go silent and stop performing, you finally become yourself. And people who need the performance will hate that. Let them hate it. Let them leave. The people who respect you in silence, who like you without the performance, those are your real people. Some relationships will end when you go silent. Good. Those relationships were only valuable because they fed off your performance. They were parasitic. They were draining. They were keeping you small. When you go quiet, they'll reveal themselves. And you'll get to choose whether to keep them or let them go. Most of the time, you'll let them go. And you'll be lighter for it. The repetition that embeds this. I stop performing for an audience that doesn't exist. I live for myself. Say it, write it. Internalize it. Every time you feel the urge to explain yourself, every time you feel the pressure to perform, every time you want to convince someone of your worth, I stop performing for an audience that doesn't exist. I live for myself, because that's the truth. The audience was never real. It was your imagination. It was you projecting judgment onto people who weren't actually judging you, and you've been performing for that phantom audience your entire life. Now let's talk about what happens when you actually do this. When you stop sharing, when you stop updating, when you stop explaining, when you keep your inner life private, your thoughts, your feelings, your decisions, your dreams, your struggles, all of it stays private. It stays yours. When people ask about your life, you give brief answers. Good. That's it. How's work going? Good. How's your family? Everyone's fine. How are your plans coming? Moving forward. You're not being rude. You're being boundaried. You're not being cold. You're being clear. When people push for more detail, you stay silent, or you repeat the brief answer. You don't elaborate. You don't soften. You don't explain why you're not sharing. You just exist in your privacy. And something remarkable happens. Your life becomes yours. Not something you're constantly reporting on. Not something that exists in other people's minds as a narrative. Your life becomes an actual lived experience instead of a performed story. Your privacy isn't rudeness. It's sovereignty. You get to decide what's shared and what's sacred. You get to decide who has access to your inner world and who doesn't. You get to decide what stays private and what gets revealed. That's not selfishness. That's sanity. That's protection. That's respect for yourself and for the boundaries that separate your life from everyone else's. Start today. 1 week. Complete privacy about your personal life. Don't share anything that isn't directly necessary. Keep your inner world completely private. Your thoughts about what people say, your feelings about situations, your plans for the future, your struggles, your hopes, all of it stays internal. Notice how powerful it feels. Notice how different people treat you. Notice how the energy that was going into performance starts going into actual living. You've just experienced what the rest of your life could be. The repetition that embeds this practice. My inner world is not open for consumption. This is where my real power lives, because that's the truth. Your power isn't in what you say. Your power is in what you keep private. Your power is in the parts of you that nobody has access to. Your power is in the mystery, in the boundaries, in the refusal to be completely known or completely consumed by other people's expectations. When your inner world is private, you have a place to stand that's completely yours. Nobody else's judgment lives there. Nobody else's expectation lives there. Nobody else's need lives there. You're completely safe in your own mind, completely untouchable, completely free. That's where real strength comes from. Not from being transparent, from being private. Not from being known, from being mysterious. Not from proving yourself, from refusing to perform. You've learned that most of your speech is performance for an imaginary audience. You've learned that stopping the performance reclaims extraordinary energy. You've learned that people will push back when you go silent, and that those people need to go. You've learned that your silence reveals who you actually are, and that only real people will stick around. You've learned the practice of complete privacy and what it actually feels like to reclaim your inner world. You're not just learning to speak less anymore. You're learning to live less for others and more for yourself. You're learning what it feels like to be genuinely free from the performance. To be genuinely yourself. To live a genuinely private life where the only person you have to answer to is you. But here's what comes next. Because freedom feels terrifying to most people. Because when you go silent, when you stop performing, when you reclaim your inner world, you're left with yourself. And that's where the real work begins. Because you have to actually like who you are when nobody's watching. You have to actually respect yourself. You have to actually know that your worth exists, independent of anyone else's approval. That's the final level. That's where the silent life becomes unshakable. You need to know at your deepest level that your silence is powerful because you've chosen it, not because you're afraid of speech. You need to believe that your accomplishments don't need announcement because they're real. You need to feel that your worth is already established, so you don't need to prove it. That's the foundation, and everything else builds on that. Chapter 10. The Silent Life, Living Authentically. When you stop performing, you've learned all the mechanics. You know how to pause. You know how to stay silent. You know how to build a reputation on selectivity. Now you're going to learn what it actually feels like when you stop performing. And this is where everything changes. Not because the techniques work better, but because you finally get your life back. Most of your speech isn't actually communication. It's performance. You're explaining your life to imaginary judges. You're defending choices no one asked you to defend. You're performing versions of yourself that exhaust you. You're trying to convince people of things nobody questions. You're living in a constant state of justification. and it's destroying you. Think about how much energy goes into this. Every explanation is energy. Every defense is energy. Every time you soften your words to make someone else comfortable, you're spending energy. Every time you overshare to make someone like you, you're spending energy. Every time you perform certainty you don't feel, you're spending energy. That energy is finite, and you're hemorrhaging it constantly. The moment you stop this performance, the moment you go silent about your private life, your decisions, your reasoning, your beliefs, your struggles, you reclaim extraordinary energy. Energy that's been stolen from you. You don't have to be on anymore. You don't have to convince anyone. You don't have to prove your worth through words. You don't have to explain your existence to people who never asked to judge it in the first place. This is liberation. And most people never experience it because they never stop performing. They die having spent their entire lives explaining themselves to an audience that was never really paying attention. They spent their energy on an imaginary jury that didn't exist. They performed until they were empty. Here's what's remarkable. When you stop performing, you become more effective, not less. Not because you're working harder, because you're not wasting energy on the performance. A person spends 5 years telling people about their fitness journey. Every week they're updating their friends, they're sharing their struggles, they're explaining their diet changes, they're talking about their goals. They're exhausted from the performance, from the constant updating and explaining and convincing people that yes, they're really doing this. Then they stop talking about it. They go quiet. 1 year later, they've made more progress than they made in the 5 years of performance. Why? Because the energy that went into explaining has gone into doing. They're not performing anymore. They're just living. And living is infinitely more powerful than performing. But here's what happens when you go silent. People notice, and some of them won't like it. Because your silence changes the dynamic they were comfortable with. They need the performance from you. They need you to be a certain way to make themselves feel better. They need your struggle to make their struggle feel validated. They need your uncertainty to make their own uncertainty feel normal. When you go silent and stop performing, you destabilize that dynamic. And they'll push back, they'll criticize you. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you're being cold or distant or mean. They'll try to pull you back into the old pattern of performing and explaining and justifying. They'll make you feel like you're doing something wrong by refusing to perform for them anymore. You're not doing anything wrong. You're reclaiming your life. The truth is, you haven't changed. You've finally stopped pretending. You were never meant to be the person you were performing as. That version of you was exhausting because it wasn't real. It was a construction designed to appease people who didn't deserve your energy in the first place. When you go silent and stop performing, you finally become yourself. And people who need the performance will hate that. Let them hate it. Let them leave. The people who respect you in silence, who like you without the performance, those are your real people. Some relationships will end when you go silent. Good. Those relationships were only valuable because they fed off your performance. They were parasitic. They were draining. They were keeping you small. When you go quiet, they'll reveal themselves. And you'll get to choose whether to keep them or let them go. Most of the time, you'll let them go. And you'll be lighter for it. The repetition that embeds this. I stop performing for an audience that doesn't exist. I live for myself. Say it, write it, internalize it. Every time you feel the urge to explain yourself, every time you feel the pressure to perform, every time you want to convince someone of your worth, I stop performing for an audience that doesn't exist. I live for myself. Because that's the truth. The audience was never real. It was your imagination. It was you projecting judgment onto people who weren't actually judging you. And you've been performing for that phantom audience your entire life. Now let's talk about what happens when you actually do this. When you stop sharing. When you stop updating. When you stop explaining. When you keep your inner life private. Your thoughts. Your feelings. Your decisions. Your dreams. your struggles. All of it stays private. It stays yours. When people ask about your life, you give brief answers. Good. That's it. How's work going? Good. How's your family? Everyone's fine. How are your plans coming? Moving forward. You're not being rude. You're being boundaried. You're not being cold. You're being clear. When people push for more detail, you stay silent. Or you repeat the brief answer. You don't elaborate. You don't soften. You don't explain why you're not sharing. You just exist in your privacy. And something remarkable happens. Your life becomes yours. Not something you're constantly reporting on. Not something that exists in other people's minds as a narrative. Your life becomes an actual lived experience instead of a performed story. Your privacy isn't rudeness. It's sovereignty. You get to decide what's shared and what's sacred. You get to decide who has access to your inner world and who doesn't. You get to decide what stays private and what gets revealed. That's not selfishness. That's sanity. That's protection. That's respect for yourself and for the boundaries that separate your life from everyone else's. Start today. 1 week, complete privacy about your personal life. Don't share anything that isn't directly necessary. Keep your inner world completely private. Your thoughts about what people say. Your feelings about situations. Your plans for the future. Your struggles. Your hopes. All of it stays internal. Notice how powerful it feels. Notice how different people treat you. Notice how the energy that was going into performance starts going into actual living. You've just experienced what the rest of your life could be. The repetition that embeds this practice. My inner world is not open for consumption. This is where my real power lives. Because that's the truth. Your power isn't in what you say. Your power is in what you keep private. Your power is in the parts of you that nobody has access to. Your power is in the mystery, in the boundaries, in the refusal to be completely known or completely consumed by other people's expectations. When your inner world is private, you have a place to stand that's completely yours. Nobody else's judgment lives there. Nobody else's expectation lives there. Nobody else's need lives there. You're completely safe in your own mind. Completely untouchable, completely free. That's where real strength comes from. Not from being transparent, from being private. Not from being known, from being mysterious. Not from proving yourself, from refusing to perform. You've learned that most of your speech is performance for an imaginary audience. You've learned that stopping the performance reclaims extraordinary energy. You've learned that people will push back when you go silent and that those people need to go. You've learned that your silence reveals who you actually are, and that only real people will stick around. You've learned the practice of complete privacy and what it actually feels like to reclaim your inner world. You're not just learning to speak less anymore. You're learning to live less for others and more for yourself. You're learning what it feels like to be genuinely free from the performance. To be genuinely yourself. To live a genuinely private life where the only person you have to answer to is you. But here's what comes next. Because freedom feels terrifying to most people. Because when you go silent, when you stop performing, when you reclaim your inner world, you're left with yourself. And that's where the real work begins. Because you have to actually like who you are when nobody's watching. You have to actually respect yourself. You have to actually know that your worth exists independent of anyone else's approval. That's the final level. That's where the silent life becomes unshakable.